The Linnean society, as Howard said, is the oldest active society devoted to natural history in the world. And well, what better place is there to deliver a talk on evolution, and specifically on the evolution of human male homosexuality. I'm a man with a mission. The first mission is to try and figure out how the slides move to the next. Let me see. Yep, there we are. Sorry, Padma, I scared you. I'm here to promote a book. It's a recent book that I wrote with a colleague of mine, my dear friend and colleague Andreas debunk. The book is called, as Howard said, of Maybugs and Men, and we published it late last year in December. It's a book, as the subtitle says, you can't probably read it, a history and philosophy of the sciences of homosexuality. There's, you know, I don't know, 5 chapters or something, each chapter devoted to a particular science's dealings with homosexuality. So we have a chapter on genetics, we have a chapter on zoology, animal homosexuality, which is quite fun. There's a lot of pictures. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to sell this. We have a chapter on evolutionary biology, of course, which is the one I will talk about today. And one on psychiatry, is also one on AI and homosexuality and so on. So, and I'll be talking about the chapter on evolutionary biology, as I said, but let me first make a few preliminary remarks. I mean, make it take a while. I'm a philosopher after all. So first of all, about the title, it's called Maybugs and Men, and you know, man is not referring here to mankind, but definitely to men, as in the male sex, right? So our book is about human male homosexuality, and you know, I'd rather sort of anticipate this remark that why, you know, focus on male homosexuality? I mean, there's also female homosexuality. So why do you focus on male homosexuality? Now, we explained this at length, and I'm not going to do it again here in the introduction of our book, but let me just give you 2 reasons. A silly one to begin with, and then a less silly one. The silly one is that somehow, I mean, there's much more information, scientific information about homosexuality, about human male homosexuality rather than female homosexuality, which is probably due to the fact that, you know, the ones who did that work were mostly men. But I think there's also perhaps a more interesting reason why male homosexuality has always had a bit more interest in the sciences and philosophy, which is that somehow, I mean, male homosexuality has always been more controversial than female homosexuality, right? There's this beautiful story about Michel Foucault, the French philosopher and historian, writing about how at a certain moment in time, I think it was 18th century or so, people started asking this question, like, what are these men doing together? I mean, before that, there were sort of ritualized, culturally accepted niches in which male homosexuals, you know, could be who they were. You know, it's the amicizia and so on, but that's a long story. But then all of a sudden, these niches disappeared, and then people started asking, like, what are these men doing together, right? And I don't think that question was asked about women living together. I mean, they had probably more niches, I don't know. But so that's one reason, right? So there's always been more interest in male homosexuality. The second, and perhaps a bit more substantial reason why we focus on male homosexuality is that what little we know about female homosexuality seems to suggest that it is quite different in many respects from male homosexuality, right? So, I mean, the differences are, you know, manifold. Just to give you an idea, I mean, on a behavioral level, there are, you know, differences. For example, male homosexuals are rather more active sexually than female homosexuals. If you set out, you know, males and females, I mean, men and women, on a sort of scale, whatever, a Kinsey scale, you know, where the one end is, you know, exclusive homosexuality, the other end is exclusive heterosexuality, then what you find with women is that they sort of nicely distributed all over the continuum. whereas with men, it's a bit more sort of, skewed towards the end. So that, but then more importantly, perhaps we know already that, when it comes to etiology, like the causes of homosexuality, there are differences as well. And let me just give a quick flavor of what those differences might be. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but let me just briefly introduce it to you now. There is one sort of substantial effect that's been found in scientific research on homosexuality, which is called the fraternal birth order effect, FBOE, it's called, which is basically the idea that the number of older brothers one has is a sort of predictor for the sexual orientation of later born men. So the more older brothers you have, the more likely you as a man will be gay. Now, this is a funny effect, right? We don't know what's sort of causing the effect. But there is, there are hunches, there are hypotheses explaining that effect, referring to hormones, endocrinological explanations, which we won't go into here. Importantly, the effect only occurs in males. So it's just the older, number of older brothers predicting the sexual orientation of later born sons or brothers, right? It's not the number of older sisters explaining, later born sons' sexual orientation. It doesn't explain sexual orientation of women, number of older brothers. So it seems to be something. And that, this is just one example of how, on the sort of causal level, there are differences between male and female homosexuality. This is all sort of making a disclaimer here. I know people are interested or sometimes critical of why we focus on male homosexuality, but we have a couple of reasons. If they're good reasons, I don't know, but we have reasons. Anyway, so another thing I needed to tell you about. So if you look at the subtitle, it says History and Philosophy of the Sciences of Homosexuality. So I'm a philosopher, as Howard correctly told you, with an interest in what's called HPS, so History and Philosophy of Science. But this book, this talk is not a science book, it's not a science talk, it's a history and philosophy of science book and talk. Today I'll focus a bit on a philosophy, particularly philosophy of science, because there's plenty of history in the book as well, because it's very interesting to look at how historically, we have a beautiful, sorry, this sounds a little bit arrogant, but it's a very beautiful story about a sort of entomological debate in the 1900s, late 1800s, about homosexuality in cockchafers. Maybugs, basically. So that's why we have the title. So there's plenty of history in that. But today there'll be, I'll focus on philosophy, philosophy of evolutionary biology. That's philosophy of science. Now, some of you, I don't know, I can't sort of judge, but from your faces, but some people are very skeptical of the use of philosophy, generally philosophy of science. Some scientists, for example, are very dismissive of philosophers who study their discipline. You remember, the Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman once saying that philosophy of science is as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds. And you get the joke, I guess. Sometimes I have to explain this, but obviously it says it's of no use whatsoever to scientists. Now, of course, I disagree with Feynman, and I'm not the only one. So a couple of years ago, some scientists and philosophers teamed up to advocate the importance of philosophy of science for the sciences, and they consider three uses of the philosophy of science, and I think the second and the third one are most important here today in my talk. So first of all, they say, well, philosophers always been good at analyzing or clarifying, even improving certain concepts that we use in various spheres of life, including, of course, the sciences. And indeed, our book details a lot of sort of conceptual debates about particular phenomena, like the concept of innateness, for example, or the concept of homosexuality itself, about which I'll talk a little bit today, the concept of disorder, the concept of desire. So that's typically, conceptual analysis is a philosophical business, right? And it's, I mean, some scientists like to do that, conceptual analysis. I mean, for their own sciences, but most scientists don't have time, for that stuff. So that's where philosophers step in. Now, secondly, I think philosophers of science make themselves useful in scrutinizing assumptions underlying scientific work, right? So over time, some of these assumptions underlying scientific research have become so commonplace as to be virtually sort of invisible, and that's where philosophers again can step in. And that's what we'll be doing today. And then thirdly, I think a third use of philosophy of science is to do with fostering dialogue. So dialogue among the sciences. I mean, dialogue is, I mean, I can talk about this all night, but there's not much dialogue within, the group of sciences. And that's sort of, it's an obstruction to, I think, interdisciplinarity. But philosophers are sort of keen to foster dialogue between sciences from different groups and areas. And it's something that scientists, again, don't have, much time or interest for. So anyway, that's a bit of preliminary work. Sorry about that. It needed to happen. Just to be clear on what I'm doing here, what I will be doing tonight, which is in some way philosophy of science. But don't run away. It'll be fun. So here's the overview of what I'll do today. I'll first talk to you about the riddle, right? So homosexuality has traditionally been presented as a sort of evolutionary riddle, and I'll explain why that is. Then I provide two solutions. I mean, there are many more. These are quite representative. I think one hypothesis compares human male homosexuals to sickle cell patients. Another one compares them to sugar daddies, which explains the title of my talk. And then the most important part of my talk is the final third part. It's about the assumptions underlying this kind of hypothesis, evolutionary hypothesis about human male homosexuality. And I discussed two assumptions. There may be more. I mean, I have to sort of limit myself. One assumption is to do with homogeneity. The question about the homogeneity of that population of human male homosexuals. So how homogeneous is that group? And then there's another assumption about reproductive success. It's about the number of offspring that human male homosexuals produce. And my argument is, I mean, roughly that some contemporary evolutionary hypotheses ignore what I call the diversity of homosexual phenotypes or form of homosexuality, particularly by overestimating the importance of one form of homosexuality that we 21st century Westerners are most familiar with, which I call modern homosexuality. And what these hypotheses do, they also disregard other forms of homosexuality, which are very well documented by historians and anthropologists, cross-cultural anthropologists, for example. And again, so what I'll try to do is sort of foster a dialogue between the evolutionary hypothesis, evolutionary biology on the one hand, and the sort of human sciences on the other hand, history, anthropology, sexology, and so on. So that's the plan, right? So, I mean, just to show that there's plenty of books with the riddle element in the title. So there's one book, Conundrum. There's another book, The Puzzle, exploring the evolutionary puzzle of male homosexuality. There's a book called Homo Mysterious. I mean, there are paradoxes, puzzles, mysteries, riddles, and so on. And so the question is, why would homosexuality, human male homosexuality, be a riddle? Well, let me explain to you. It's, fairly simple. It's basically the conclusion of an argument that consists of three premises, which you see here on the slide. And if all these three premises are sound, then you're supposed to accept the conclusion. So the first premise goes that there are such things as genes involved in the development of human sexual orientation. Talk about gay genes. I'm not I don't doubt that there are, genes involved in explaining some people's, some people's sexual orientation. Even though, I mean, we must be honest in acknowledging that since the 1990s, when there was a sort of boost in genetic research on homosexuality, that research has made notoriously little headway. But I'll leave that aside just now. Maybe I'll return to it briefly later in my talk. Let's just accept that this is indeed the case. We don't know which genes, how many of them, I mean, how relevant they are, how common they are. I mean, we don't know if all homosexuals have those genes and so on, but yeah, passons. A second premise is more relevant. It holds that human male homosexuals do not produce offspring. And it's true that many contemporary human male homosexuals are indeed exclusively homosexual. It means they don't do straight sex. And to this day, you need that kind of sex to, produce children. Maybe one day that will change, eternal pregnancy and all that. But for now, that's not the case. And so, I mean, there's something quirky going on here. I mean, it's true that there are gay genes and that, homosexuals don't reproduce. You would expect these genes to sort of disappear sooner or later, right? Out of the gene pool. And curiously, that hasn't happened. And that brings us to the third premise, which is that homosexuality has always existed, right? So, I mean, most evolutionists seem to believe that human homosexuality has been around for at least thousands of years already, and it doesn't look like it's about to disappear. So here's the riddle. I mean, how come homosexuality is still around if there are such things as gay genes and if homosexuals don't reproduce and if homosexuality has always existed? Now, this is a mystery, right? That's the riddle for you. Now, of course, I mean, what we have to do is to sort of scrutinize those assumptions, because I think something logical science can do. And for example, the claim that homosexuality has always existed will have to be sort of nuanced. Because then the question is, well, is that the same thing, right? We see sort of forms of homosexuality popping up in the written documents or whatever we have. But the question will be, are all these things the same, right? That's the question about homogeneity. So let me give you two solutions to these this riddle, right? Just to give you a flavor of how evolutionary work on homosexuality is done. So one solution to the riddle of homosexuality is based on an analogy, which is a famous medical case study from the 1950s. Probably some of you know. It's a relationship between sickle cell anemia and malaria. So sickle cell anemia is a serious medical condition. It's a blood disorder, and it's prevalent among people of what we call tropical descent. It means roughly the Middle East, India, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. On the map above, I mean, on top of the slide, what you see is that these regions in which sickle cell anemia is endemic are marked in red, right? And sickle cell anemia, the prevalence of it matches up with the prevalence of the infamous malaria parasite, as shown on the slide, the bottom of the slide. And that turns out not to be a coincidence. In fact, it's been shown that genetics is called heterozygote relatives of sickle cell patients. And I mean, heterozygote relatives, basically relatives with a slightly, different genetic makeup for that particular locus in their DNA. So these heterozygote relatives, brothers or sisters and whatever, have an increased resistance to malaria. So what you have is a sort of, you have something sort of balancing each other out. So sickle cell anemia, on the one hand, is sort of price that the family or society or whatever community or population pays for its increased resistance to malaria, which is, let us be clear, sort of life-threatening, potentially life-threatening disease in some parts of the world. It's a sort of trade-off, right? That's the idea. That's the model that's sort of inherent in this explanation, the sickle cell hypothesis. And the analogy goes that human male homosexuals would be like sickle cell patients in the sense that perhaps their lack of reproductive success is then made up by some favorable features found in heterozygote relatives of these homosexuals. And of course, the question is like, what advantages are we talking about? There are plenty of hypotheses again. I mean, this is a very sort of a rich field of study. So one hypothesis goes that, and just try to understand female relatives of male homosexuals, right? So particularly maternal aunts of human male homosexuals compensate for the lowered reproductive success in male homosexuals by producing more offspring than female relatives of male heterosexuals, right? So compared to heterosexual males, homosexual males would have more nephews and nieces, at least in their mother's families. And somehow this abundance would make up for their own lack of offspring. Right? That's the idea. You see the point, I hope. And it is indeed some research that shows that at least 20% of homosexual men, this is indeed the case, right? That their maternal aunts are relatively more fertile, fecund, at least in Caucasian families. So that's one hypothesis, and this slide is just a slide to show you a big family. I hope they don't mind me using that slide. So there's another hypothesis, which is a very interesting one. It's called the sugar daddy hypothesis. And it goes back to the 1970s. It was sort of thought of by Edward Wilson, an entomologist. And it's based on the principle of kin selection rather than balancing selection, but that doesn't really matter. So the idea is that homosexuals don't produce offspring themselves, but perhaps their genes are preserved in the gene pool because homosexuals invest quite a bit of time and energy and means in close relatives with whom they share a more or less substantial amount of DNA. Right. So what Wilson speculated is that human male homosexuals may well be some kind of sugar daddies, to the extent that they prefer, between brackets, to assist siblings in raising their children rather than bringing children into the world themselves. Right. It's a sugar daddy story. And initially, you're probably wondering what's the photo about. So initially, Wilson's hypothesis didn't fare well in finding supporting evidence, especially in the West. But in recent years, it got a bit of backup through interesting data produced by Paul Vasey, a Canadian psychologist. And the research is on the so-called farfine. So that's, you see, the adult you see is one of these farfine. And these are a group of homosexual men on Samoa, which is an island in the Pacific, South Pacific. I had to look this up myself. And in Samoa, farfine are known as effeminate homosexual men who only have sex, and this is really interesting, with individuals who identify as men, particularly as heterosexual men. And what Vasey, the psychologist I was talking about, found out is that compared to both heterosexual men and women, farfine invest much more in offspring of close relatives, particularly young girls of female siblings. There's a particular explanation for that, it doesn't matter. So here's a beautiful picture taken by David Pocock on Samoa. It's a Samoan farfine with his niece. Now, these are just two representative and somehow sort of substantiated hypotheses about the evolution of and persistence, particularly evolutionary persistence of human male homosexuality. And so there are many more, but what I'd like to do now with you is to look into the assumptions on which they build. Right? There are two assumptions that I think are, at least dubitable and perhaps even downright erroneous. One of which is to do with the homogeneity of human male homosexuality. I explained this already, but the question is, are homosexual men all over the world essentially the same, right, in some relevant respect, and have they always been the same? And the second hypothesis is to do with reproductive success, right? So the question whether homosexuals do not indeed reproduce as these assumptions, as these hypotheses seem to assume. What I'd like to do, what I try to do, is to debunk both of these assumptions. If I'll be successful, I'll leave that up to you. Right. So one way to frame the objections that I bring up in the book, because it's, we do that at length in the book. I'm giving you some kind of summary here. So one way to frame my objection is to connect them with a marvelous body of work produced by Joe Hendrick and his colleague. Joe Hendrick is I think he's a Canadian-born psychologist who just got an honorary degree, doctorate from the Leuven, my home university. It's super interesting work. I mean, I would recommend you reading it as soon as you can. It's his work on weird people. Let me explain a bit that. So Hendrick calculated that no less than 96% of contemporary psychological and behavioral research is based on samples drawn entirely from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. These are called weird societies, right? Weird as an acronym, but I'll get to that point. Weird also in the more basic sense of the word. And that's bizarre because these weird people, they constitute only perhaps 12% of humanity. I mean, we are weird people, right? We are one of those people living in these a weird society. So we tend to forget that we are not quite representative of all humanity. Indeed, I mean, weird individuals like us turn out to be statistical outliers in various contexts. I mean, let me just give you one simple example. This is the Miller-Lyer illusion. It's a visual illusion, right? This is about perception. So it's about this is part of the, mental stuff. It's a mental capacity, our ability to perceive. So visual perception has enormous cultural variation. And you can see that in our susceptibility to visual illusions. We weird people, I mean, I'm sort of generalizing here. I'm sorry if there's someone non-weird in the audience. But what we see, I mean, line segments that are differing in length, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the illusion. We tend to think that the lower line segment is a bit shorter than the upper one, which is not the case, by the way. I mean, in case you didn't know. So we tend to be very susceptible to that illusion, but many non-weird individuals are less susceptible, and some aren't at all. So there's beautiful data, for example, on the Sun. It's a sort of nomadic society, nomadic people in the Kalahari Desert, and they are not susceptible to that illusion at all. They'll tell you straight away these lengths are perfectly equal. These line segments are perfectly equal in length. So there's a huge variability, even in the most basic mental capacities that we have, such as visual perception. And so what's interesting is that Hendrick doesn't talk about sexuality. He doesn't talk about sexual orientation, doesn't talk about homosexuality. But I believe his conclusions do apply in this area as well. So my work is in some sense a sort of extension of his work. And the basic idea is if we 21st century Westerners or weirdos are a minority indeed of eccentrics or outliers in a statistical sense, then it's perhaps a bit rash and misleading to assume that our homosexuals, right, the kind of homosexuality that we know here is representative of all kinds of homosexuality in all times, in all cultures. Right? So that's the basic argument that we put forward in the book chapter. Now, in fact, that's not quite new, right? I mean, in some sense, some historians have defended something similar, some similar argument, and one of them is David Halperin. He's a very interesting historian of sexuality, an American. He's in Chicago, I think. And here's David Halperin saying something. This is a bit quirky, but he's saying something in this book about an earlier book of his, right? So in How to Do the History of Homosexuality, he's talking about an earlier book and sort of, admonishing himself for something he said in that earlier book. And this is what he said. My book, you can read with me, my book, The 100 Years of Homosexuality, opted for a disciplinary vigor in differentiating between past and present forms of homosexuality, never more so than in its insistence that homosexuality was a modern cultural production, and that there was no homosexuality, and I repeat, there was no homosexuality, properly speaking, in classical Greece. There was no homosexuality in the ancient Mediterranean world, or indeed in most pre-modern or non-Western societies. I'm sorry about the lengthy quote, but I hope you get the point. So he's saying there was no homosexuality. Let's just focus on Greece now, in ancient Greece. And take a moment to let this sink in. And then look at the next slide. And I'm sorry, I have to warn you that there's some sort of graphic stuff coming up. What does he mean that there was no homosexuality in ancient Greece? I mean, there certainly was no lack of gay porn in classical Greece. I mean, if you look at these vases, I mean, we have plenty of vases, and they all have images, quite explicit. I mean, gee, you have to, and they're doing funny things, and this is sort of new porn of its time, I guess, these vases. But anyway, I mean, what could Halperin possibly be talking about? I mean, what is this if it's not homosexuality? Well, there you go. That's the use of scare quotes, right? If you go back to the quote and we focus on that bold word in the middle, it's homosexuality, but it's homosexuality. So what does that mean? What does the scare quotes mean? Well, what Halperin is alluding to, I think, is to something we call dimensions of homosexuality. So we tend to forget that if we're talking about homosexuality, we're talking about many things, really. But I mean, to begin with, there are a number of aspects or dimensions of homosexuality that we should sort of distinguish. And it's important to distinguish them for reasons that I'll explain to you and that relate to the quote by Halperin. So let's just go through them. So on the basic level, there's homosexual behavior. I mean, I don't think there's many historians denying that in the past we've had homosexual behaviors. I mean, if you look at the vases that I showed you, I mean, these are behaviors, right? I mean, and if you want a definition of behavior, it's sort of any kind of physical sexual activity, right? And it's homosexual behavior, so it's about one or more persons of the same sex. So behaviors, yes, we've had those, and nobody disputes that. There's also a sizable consensus about the historical invariance of homosexual desires, right? Now, what's a desire? You wonder, well, some philosophers would say it's a disposition to act in a certain way that makes it more likely that you get the object, right? So it's a sort of motivational kind of desire, right? And so you can measure desire by measuring the length to which people go in order to get something, right? I mean, these men on these vases in ancient Greece, I mean, they would probably do quite a bit to get together, right? I mean, they were desiring each other. So I mean, there's not much dispute about that. But it becomes a bit more controversial when we talk about preferences, orientations, and particularly homosexual identity. So what is a homosexual preference? I mean, some people say we shouldn't use that word. We have a quite lengthy, part in the book, which we get annoyed at people, suggesting we use alternative terms. Right? We shouldn't use homosexual, for example. We can talk about that in the Q&A. Homosexuality, according to some people, would sort of stink a bit too much of that medical history. We argue against that. We argue against those who say we shouldn't use the term homosexual preference. I mean, I understand that some people have a problem with even the suggestion that there is some element of choice, in homosexuality, because of course in the States and in these culture wars, is people saying that homosexuality is a choice, which is, I mean, sounds bizarre, isn't it? I mean, somebody waking up and saying like, what am I going to be? Am I going to be gay or straight? I mean, I'll choose gay. You know, that's not what happens, right? I mean, but there are choices and choices, right? I mean, you don't need a philosophy to know that. I mean, there's a difference, you know, choosing between this kind of crisp and that kind of crisp, and then making life choices. I mean, going to university. I mean, these are very complicated choices that you make, which are totally overdetermined. I mean, I don't have to tell you this probably, but so I think it's you know, you can say and safely say that some men prefer to have sex with other men rather than women, right? But there is indeed an element of choice, which, I mean, I'll just skip over now. But the problem with the concept of preference is that it may be a one-off thing, like it doesn't need to be stable. That's where the orientation comes in, right? So if you're talking about an homosexual orientation, then there's an element of stability, right? So this is about men continuously, permanently, exclusively desiring, preferring to have sex with other men and behaving in that way. Now, the question whether there is such a thing as homosexual orientation in ancient Greece or in whatever pre-modern society or in non-Western society today, I mean, let's skip over those. But there is a sort of consensus, even among historians, that, you know, it's kind of hard to talk about homosexual identity in ancient Greece. And so when Halperin says there's no homosexuality in ancient Greece, what he's actually saying is that there is no such thing as an homosexual identity in ancient Greece. If you wonder what that is, I mean, for some people maybe that's intuitively clear. I mean, basically, to define identity is to say it's one way of answering the question, who am I? So if I ask you the question, who are you? And, you know, in the first few words that you use, the word gay or homosexual, then that sexual orientation is part of who you are, you know, your identity. And that is apparently something new, right? If we may trust historians. And that's what Halperin actually telling us, right? This is not something that's always been there. So all these dimensions of homosexuality, I mean, they haven't always been there. You know, some aspects, some dimensions have become more visible or more common in certain areas, certain times, certain places. Now, all of that goes to show that our third premise, I'm not sure if you remember, so I'll repeat, the third premise was that homosexuality has always existed. Now we know that we should qualify that, because what are we talking about? Which dimensions of homosexuality are we talking about? And I think it's quite clear that through time and across cultures, homosexuality is not a highly homogeneous category of people, at least not as homogeneous as some scientists would have us believe. Some kinds of homosexuality, some dimensions of homosexuality, at the very least, haven't always existed, or haven't always been as conspicuous as they are now. And let me try to make that a bit more structured at this point. So there is a stark contrast, as we argue in the book, between what we call modern homosexuality on the one hand. So that's the kind of homosexuality with which we, you know, again, 21st century Westerners are most familiar with. I mean, the one on the right on the slide, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there is what we would call, for lack of a better word, pre-modern homosexuality or non-modern homosexuality. And that's a phenomenon that we find in the distant past, for example, in ancient Greece, right? But also in more recent history. When we look, for example, at pre-industrial Japan, that's the middle picture on the slide. And importantly, this non-modern kind of homosexuality can still be found today in some non-weird societies, so non-Western, highly educated, non-industrialized societies. Let me try to explain that. So what is the difference? I mean, what differences are we talking about? So first, there's three differences, I think. So the first difference is to do with the dimensions that I just referred to. right? The aspects of homosexuality. So for the ancient Greeks, right, for cultures with similar practices, homosexuality was merely a set of behaviors that were embedded and encouraged in a complex world of manly virtues. But for modern homosexuals, sexuality is a key characteristic of their identity. So that's an important difference on the level of dimensions. Then there is also a gender difference. We shouldn't overestimate that, but it is definitely there. What do I mean? Well, some modern homosexuals are markedly feminine. I think about the very first modern homosexuals that have been documented in historical literature. As far as we know, these are the 18th century mollies, as they were called. It's here in London. And mollies were adult homosexual men who performed the female role in what's called molly houses. There's a sort of private tavern where they acquired a female name. They wore women's clothes. They spoke in high voices and so on. You could compare them to the Firefafine, I guess, on some level. But in contrast, most pre-modern or non-modern homosexuals engaged in homosexual activities to enhance their masculinity, right? One non-weird society that I would like to bring up is the Zambia. People been documented by Gilbert Hurt, an anthropologist in the late 20th century in Papua New Guinea. The Zambia, for example, they require young boys and adolescents to regularly ingest semen of a senior group of members in order to achieve manhood. And that starts at about the age of 8.5 on average years old. Right? Again, in the Zambia, homosexuality is very much embedded in a sort of culture of manliness, right? Masculinity, which is in contrast to what we see in some kinds of modern homosexuality. Because of course we shouldn't essentialize modern homosexuality either, but that's another issue. And there's a third difference, which has to do with status, right? So modern homosexuality is distinctly egalitarian. Most partners share more or less the same age, social status, and so on. That was obviously not the case in ancient Greece, where homosexuality was much more asymmetrical, right? You have to look a bit more closely at, for example, this picture of the vase, but you can see that one man, the one who's touching the penis of the other, has a beard and the other one doesn't. So the one on the left is called the Erastus. So that's the older man. Not old in sort of age terms, but relatively older than the other one. And the other one doesn't have a beard. That's the erroneous, right? And so it's all about an adult male having a sexual relationship with a young man or an older boy, as it is the case in the Zambia, which I just referred to. And so interestingly, in ancient Greece, classical Greece, homosexuality and reproductive success were in fact compatible. Classical Greece wasn't an exception either. Many non-modern homosexuals, non-Western male homosexuals, did and still do have sexual relations with both men and women. And very often they were married, produced children themselves. I mean, the Erastus, the man with the beard on the left, he was married, right? He had children. He didn't like to have sex with his wife, certainly because, somehow having sex with a woman was supposed to sort of sap your masculinity, drain your masculinity. That's the same, by the way, in the Zambia. The same for the samurai in medieval and early modern Japan. So we see a number of patterns emerge, right? Now, I'm trying not to sort of essentialize non-modern homosexuality nor modern homosexuality. You can see some sort of patterns of difference that I think are relevant. And relevance has to do with the main issue one of the main issues that we're dealing with here, which is, homosexuality and reproductive success. So for many non-modern homosexuals, they did have children. So their homosexuality did not detract from their reproductive success. right? This is my last slide, I think, penultimate slide. So my point is, what's my point? My point is, many points. I try to sort of bring them together. So my point is that evolutionary scientists, many perhaps, let's leave that open, overestimate the importance of one kind of homosexuality, right, which we have called modern homosexuality. It's the one that we're most familiar with, so it makes sense, right, to focus on that. Only that if we go back to that research by Hendrik, it's just the umpteenth illustration of how blind we are to what's happening, outside of our sphere of interest. We don't hear about Zambia and Papua New Guinea. It's not in the news, right? So we have a tendency to focus on, our own weirdness and reproduce that weirdness, in sort of doing research only with weird subjects. I mean, you probably know that why is 96% of the research in behavioral and psychological sciences, based on weird subjects? It's because it's all psychology minors, right? I mean, they're cheap subjects, you don't have to pay them. And there are, hundreds of them. I mean, I'm teaching to them, and there's 650 in Leuven. So, I mean, and they're all, of course, weird. I mean, they're very, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, or what have you. So that's an issue, I think, a sort of problem for the evolutionary sciences, particularly in the context of homosexuality, that focus on modern homosexuality and the blindness to other kinds of forms of homosexuality. And so the problem is that they ignore what I call the multiplicity or the heterogeneity of human male homosexuality, which, has been documented. I mean, it's there for anyone to see, right? In cross-cultural anthropology, history, sexology, history of sexology, and so on. But also by biologists, by the way. So there's no reason to expect that this modern homosexuality is going to be representative of all these other forms of kinds of homosexuality. And additionally, so what I've argued is that many manifestations of human male homosexuality were in fact compatible with reproductive success. Right. Now, so we can safely talk about homosexuality. It's actually the title of a book of one of these cross-cultural anthropologists, Stephen Murray. It's a very interesting book about the history of homosexuality. And this heterogeneity, so I focused today in this talk on heterogeneity that we see through the lens of history and culture. But you could you could take another approach by looking at the, heterogeneity in psychology and behavior of contemporary human male homosexuals. I was referring earlier to my attempts not to essentialize modern homosexuality. Well, there's plenty of things to say about the variability that we find even in that group of modern homosexuals, right? Which has to do with activeness or passiveness, which has to do with masculinity and femininity and so on. But I'll leave that aside. And then you could also, do a very similar talk about heterogeneity on the level of biology, right? So at the beginning of my talk, I already suggested that there are differences between human male and human female homosexuals on the level of etiology, causes. When you focus on human male homosexuality, we tend to forget that already there we know what little we know, but what little we know suggests or indicates that there are many sort of pathways towards homosexuality for human males, right? There is gay gene stuff, right? There's genetic trajectory, but there's also the endocrinological trajectory, which is related to that fraternal birth order effect that I talked about, right? So there is heterogeneity on multiple levels, right? And so what we try to do in the book is sort of push evolutionary biologists towards a sort of acknowledgement of that diversity or heterogeneity and so on. Now, perhaps, but I'll have to leave it at that, but perhaps you think, well, is that the end of evolutionary research on human male homosexuality? Absolutely not. So I'm not arguing that evolutionary theory is irrelevant in understanding human male homosexuality. I mean, quite the contrary. What we do at the end of this chapter in the book, but I don't have time to go over that, is to present two evolutionary hypotheses about human male homosexuality that sort of acknowledge that the diversity that I've tried to sort of present to you today. So there's one hypothesis called the alliance formation hypothesis, which is about the evolutionary value of human homosexual behavior, right? So why is it that some men desire or prefer sex with men, even if they have access to women, even if they are married, and even if they have children, right? So that's the question to ask. What's the adaptive value of certain homosexual behaviors, regardless of the fertility aspect, right? We don't have to assume that they are not reproducing at all. I mean, some of them really are. The question is just, why are they, engaging in homosexual behaviors? And then, there's plenty of interesting hypotheses about the adaptive value of homosexual behaviors. And then there's another hypothesis that we try to sort of develop, which is a sort of dual inheritance theory hypothesis. It's quite complicated. I can't sort of explain, but it's mainly about so the question how, at a certain moment in time, this modern kind of homosexuality came to be dominant, right? Came to be, at least here in the West, to be the most visible, the most common. Given that, we can believe, Halperin, that in ancient Greece there was no such thing as modern homosexuality, or perhaps a bit more nuanced to say that it wasn't as common or as visible as it is now. Right. So that's my story for today. I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction to that particular chapter of the book, and I hope I gave you some appetite to get read it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pieter, for that. I think we've got time maybe for one or two questions. I know that folks online won't be able to ask, but let's see if we can get a couple folks in the audience to start here. So for the folks online that may not have heard, our question from the audience is, to what extent are you involved in the gay community where you work?
Well, to be honest, very little, because we sort of rely on evolutionary work on homosexuality. So what we do is we study their work. I mean, obviously they relate to the gay community, get the subjects they need to do their research, but we don't sort of reach out to them. I don't. Perhaps your question is, should we? I mean, you're suggesting that we should. And why would you suggest that we do that?
One thing that you're looking at, I mean, I'm a scientist, and to get one aspect of the science under the gay. But I also know a lot of gay people who might find this a bit problematic with looking back. I was wondering how you kind of balance that, and if that's something that you come up against about people from the gay community not really, or like finding it problematic, like our questions don't, I find it fascinating.
Oh, no, I see what you mean. So I'm going to repeat that for the people online. So the question is, so perhaps some gay people would object to us studying the causes or the evolution of human male homosexuality, right? That's an interesting point. So there is, I think it's a minority of people who sort of think we shouldn't do this kind of research, right? I don't quite know that strand of sort of, I mean, I don't quite know the arguments that they bring up. I guess it's, I mean, probably related to the sort of the risks inherent in sort of in the results that would eventually, be produced by this kind of research. I mean, so some people might argue that, the results that follow from such research on, for example, the etiology of homosexuality could be misused, right? And I mean, yes, that's a sort of balance you have to make, right? I mean, it's the same with, say, nuclear energy. I mean, obviously that brought us interesting and useful stuff, but it also brought lots of human misery, right? So, but I mean, so for example, what we do in the epilogue is we criticize recent artificial intelligence research on gaydars. So there's, I mean, some seemingly cool research on computers being able to recognize people as being gay, right? It's super interesting. It's totally overhyped, as is much of this AI research. But anyway, that's another story. And what I mean, there we sort of recognize the inherent risks there, because obviously, I mean, if that would work, which it doesn't yet, I mean, maybe one day it will. But of course, that sort of technology could be misused by certain regimes who don't particularly like homosexuals. I mean, and there are many of them, right? I mean, I shouldn't tell you probably. So there's, and so that would be sort of, one example where indeed there could be risks involved in studying human male homosexuality. I don't think, I haven't heard many objections, particularly in the context of, evolutionary research, to be honest. When it comes to gay genes research, I mean, genetic research, yes, it has, but I don't think, I mean, whatever we'll find, it won't matter. I'm trying convinced that whatever we find, whether we find gay genes or we find there are no such things as gay genes, it won't matter. I mean, for us and our societal attitudes towards homosexuality, at least here in the West. But that's my personal opinion. So yeah, I mean, thank you for that question. It's interesting. Maybe I skipped over it too easily, but it's yeah, thank you.
I think we've got a question to the right. I know you've been waiting.
Sorry, it's slightly related.
Yes.
I feel a lot. I feel a lot with activists in the local health activities. And as well as we're weird in one sense. So we're increasing the social acceptance of being LGBT in this country. In 600 countries, there's been no social or no legal acceptance improvement in the last 40 years. That I don't know what it's to make is an existential issue. So back to the central war, sort of this war. If this could be popularized as a message, particularly to people who don't necessarily want to listen, and if it could be expressed clearly, that would obviously like social and political advantages for people who are facing incredibly difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
So what do you feel, I mean, is your duty for that? And is there any way of popularizing this message in a way which is easy for people to comprehend, particularly when they don't want to listen?
Yes.
So
summarize?
yes, if you will. Yeah. So
well, sorry, I mean, it's not.
yes,
It's a perfect question. Thank you for that.
continuation.
But we have to summarize for the people online. So the question is, I mean, related to the previous question. So perhaps there are rewards to, I mean, rather than sort of focusing on the risks, potential risks involved in this kind of research or scientific research on homosexuality generally. Perhaps there are rewards as well in, perhaps specifically then in projecting an image of naturalness of homosexuality, which would then sort of influence political social attitudes towards homosexuality. I mean, reduce homonegativity in a nutshell. Well, I'm very sympathetic to that argument, and I mean, it's been used in the past to sort of reduce homonegativity or homophobia or whatever you call it. But I think it's, I mean, philosophically, I have to sort of disagree. It's not a really good argument because, I mean, naturalness doesn't tell us much basically about how we as a society should relate to a particular trait, right? I mean, there's many traits that are natural, at least in the sense of that we find that particular trait in non-human animal species, right? So we find, for example, so we have a chapter on zoology and homosexuality and animal homosexuality. Lots of pictures, as I said. So, I mean, what many people do is, oh, okay, so we find homosexuality in the natural world, in non-human animals. So, you know, we shouldn't criminalize it. Or, I mean, that's been argued. I mean, I can give you brochures from, you know, exhibitions on animal homosexuality that make that point. I think I'm sympathetic to it, and I understand the argument, but I think it's a bad argument to the extent that naturalness, I mean, nature doesn't tell us anything, you know, morally speaking. I mean, there's, weird and awful stuff that we find in nature. I mean, cannibalism and incest and what have you. I mean, you find that, oh, it's all natural in a certain sense, but it doesn't mean that society we should. So, I mean, let me be clear. I'm, you know, one of the main motivations I have to do this research is to reduce homonegativity. It's just that I don't think science can really help us do that. We can make it more sort of discussable, so to speak. I mean, we can sort of bring it up more. We can make people sort of familiar with the phenomenon, with homosexuals. I mean, and that is, I think, something that can do magic, rather than the argument that you just presented.
Great. I can see that the time is going, and so for folks online, I'm sorry that we're coming to an end.